High on the wolf-toothed divide, four riders threaded a narrow trail, while a fifth figure trailed silently behind them at the tail of the string. The woman in the borrowed wool coat watched the men ahead lean their heads together, their low voices swallowed by the wind that bent the pale turning aspens. When they sent her alone up an empty drainage to scout, she rode into the rising gray, without knowing she would not see their fire again. She returned to find only trampled grass, a scattered cold fire, and 8 sets of hoofprints leading down the mountain without her. For a long moment, she sat her horse in the abandoned park, the first snow already stinging her face, understanding exactly what had been done. She turned east instead of south, away from the men, into the teeth of a storm that erased the country a rifle shot in every direction. Days later, half-starved and limping, she followed a hidden ravine to a cabin no map had ever marked, a 5-pointed star chiseled above its door. Inside, beneath a hearthstone laid by a dead man's careful hands, something waited that would answer a debt buried 20 years before she was born. Elspeth Calder was 22 years old. The summer 4 men rowed her up into the wolf-toothed divide and rowed back down without her, leaving her with a borrowed wool coat too big through the shoulders, a folding knife her grandfather had carried through 2 winters of the war, and $11 folded flat in the lining of her right boot. She had no horse by then, no shelter, no rifle, and no reason on the earth to believe that anyone in the world knew where she was or would think to come looking. But the men who cut her loose in a ravine no surveyor had ever drawn did not know one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered. Half a day's walk east of where they abandoned her, past a shoulder of gray stone the maps forgot, something had been waiting a very long time in the cold to be found by exactly the kind of person nobody counted worth finding. Settle in and stay close, and before the road grows dark, tell us in the comments where, in this wide country, you are watching from tonight. To understand what happened to her on that ridge, you have to walk backward first, down out of the high country and into the narrow years that made her. Because Elspeth Calder did not arrive in those mountains soft, and she did not arrive by accident. She had been born in a 2-room house at the ragged edge of a mill town called Halcott, the only child of a laundress named Ruth Calder and a millwright named Thomas Calder. And for the first 9 years of her life, she had lived inside a small, plain, steady kind of love that asked nothing of the world but wages, bread, and a quiet Sunday. Her father was a careful man with his hands, the sort who could feel a bad belt on a wheel through the soles of his boots before it ever slipped. And he taught her to listen to machinery the way other fathers taught their daughters to listen for church bells. Her mother sang low over the wash kettle, hymns half remembered, the words softened by steam. And Elspeth grew up believing, without ever being told, that the people who loved you would always be standing where you left them. That belief did not survive her 9th winter. A fever came through the crews at the mill that year, quiet at first, then not quiet at all. And it took her father in the space of a single hard week. And it took several of the men who had stood beside him at the great wheel. Ruth Calder was never strong after that, in body or in the part of a person that decides to keep going. And she followed her husband inside a year and a half, leaving her daughter standing in a doorway in a dress that no longer fit, holding a Bible with a cracked spine and a paper sack of clothes. There was no cruelty in any of it, only the ordinary arithmetic of a hard country. But a child does not know the difference between cruelty and arithmetic when the house goes silent. Elspeth learned that lesson the way she would learn every important thing after, without complaint, folding it down small enough to carry. She was sent up the long valley to the only blood who would have her mother's father, a man she had met exactly twice, on a wagon that smelled of onions and wet canvas. And at the end of 2 cold days, she was set down in front of a squared log house on 80 acres of timber and rough pasture that Silas Calder had held since he mustered out of the war. He was 63 years old that winter, a widower of long standing, a former Army scout, who had traded the wide movements of his younger life for the small, close trade of trapping, a handful of lot cattle, and the occasional guided hunt for soft men from the eastern cities who paid in gold coin and asked no questions he was willing to answer. He was not a talking man. He did not know the first thing about comforting a grieving child, and to his lasting credit, he did not pretend to try, because he had decided somewhere on the road to meet her that pity would ruin her faster than the cold ever could. What he did instead, beginning the very first week she stood in his cabin, with her dead mother's Bible clutched against her chest, was teach her. He taught her the way a man teaches, who believes that knowledge is the only inheritance the world cannot take back once it is given. He showed her how to skin a mink clean so the hide came off, whole and unmarked, how the aspens turn the pale undersides of their leaves before weather, how to walk across a slope of loose scree without snapping an ankle by keeping her weight low and reading the stone before she trusted it. He set a lever-action rifle in her hands the winter she turned 12, and taught her to hold her breath at the bottom, not the top, and by 14 she was casting her own bullets and seeing feel in the lamplight, while he watched from his chair and said nothing, which from Elspeth Calder was the highest form of approval a person could earn. By the time she was 16, she could throw a diamond hitch on a loaded mule in a driving wind, dress an elk in falling light without wasting a pound of it, and find her way home to his door from any drainage within 30 miles of the ridge, with nothing but the shape of the country to guide her. He never praised her for these things directly. He would only look at a job she had done, a knot she had tied, or a fire she had coaxed up out of wet wood by shaving a branch down to its dry heart, and give a single short nod and go on to the next thing. She learned to live for those nods the way another girl might live for a ribbon or a dance, and she never once felt cheated by the trade. He gave her, on the morning of her 17th birthday, the one object she would come to love above everything else she owned. It was a folding knife with a bone handle worn as smooth as a river stone, 3.5 inches of high-carbon steel that held an edge through work no ordinary blade would survive. And he set it in her palm at the breakfast table without ceremony, closing her fingers around it with his own rough hand. A person who knows the honest use of a good knife is never truly alone in this world, he told her. His voice as level as if he were remarking on the weather, and she believed him then, and she would have cause to believe him harder later. She stitched a leather sheath for it that same week, and she carried it every day of her life after. And every time her thumb found the worn bone she thought of the man who had given it. There was one evening she would return to more than any other in the years that came after, though she could not have known its weight while she was living inside it. It was late in a hard winter, the stove ticking, snow packed to the sills, and Silas had been oiling the parts of an old pistol on a square of flannel when he began, without preface, to talk about the war in a way he almost never did. He spoke of a river crossing made in the dark, of a man he had trusted his life to, for the length of one long, terrible night, a quartermaster's clerk with careful hands and a careful mind, the only man in that whole ruined country who never once lied to him. Silas had left something in that man's keeping the night of the crossing, meaning to reclaim it when the movement was over. A small brass compass with his own initials cut into the case. The movement scattered them. The war swept them apart like leaves off a porch, and he had never found the man again, nor gotten the compass back. And he had wondered about both, he admitted, every year of his life since. Some debts, he told her, folding the flannel closed, are not about the thing that was owed at all. Elspeth was 12 when she heard it. She filed it away without understanding, the way a child files away the smell of a room she will not enter again for 20 years. Silas Calder died in the spring of the year. Elspeth turned 22. He died quietly, in the chair beside the stove, a cup of coffee gone cold on the sill, and the door standing open to a warm wind off the melting slopes. And she found him that way in the morning and understood before. She crossed the room that the second half of her life had already begun. She washed him and dressed him herself because there was no one else within a day's ride to do it, and she buried him on the rise above the spring where he had told her once he wanted to lie. And she read over the raw ground the only words she knew by heart, her mother's words, in her mother's hymns, her voice steady, because he would not have wanted it otherwise. Then she went down and fed the stock, because the stock did not know that the world had ended and still needed feeding, and that, more than the grave itself, was the moment she became who she would be. The 80 acres did not pass to her. She had known in some corner of herself that it would not, but the knowing did not soften the letter. When it came 3 weeks later, carried up the valley by a boy on a mule who handed it over and turned straight back down the trail. It was written in a small, neat, self-satisfied hand by a man named Alton Calder, Silas's younger brother, who lived 200 miles south in a town Elspeth had never seen and whom she had met exactly twice in her life. Both times as a child, both times briefly. The property, the letter informed her, had passed to him by law as the nearest surviving blood, and he intended to sell it whole. She was welcome, the letter allowed, in the flat generosity of a man giving away nothing, to remain in the cabin until the sale closed, and to keep such personal effects as were truly her own. She was not welcome to any share of the money. She read the letter twice, standing in the doorway where she had once stood as a grieving child, and then she folded it along its crease, set it in the tin box on the mantel where Silas had kept his few papers, and went out to split kindling, because the evening still turned cold, and the wood still needed splitting, whether or not the roof over it belonged to her. There was a line at the bottom of that letter that stayed with her longer than the rest, a line Alton had likely thought kind. He wrote that he was sure her grandfather had left her well prepared to make her own way, as if a lifetime of skinning mink and casting bullets were a trust fund, as if a girl could carry the shape of a whole country into a bank and draw against it. She did not laugh when she read it, but she understood something in that moment that she had not fully understood before, that there were men in the world who believed that what they could not see or sell did not exist, and that such men held most of the deeds and wrote most of the letters, and that a person like herself would spend a great part of her life being counted at nothing by people who had never once been cold. There was, too, a small strange note under the courtesy of the letter, a hurry in it, as though a worn-out mountain farm 200 miles off were a thing a busy man needed settled quickly, and she noticed the hurry without understanding it, and filed that away as well. The sale closed in the second week of August. A land agent named Ambrose Teal rode up the valley on a good sorrel mare with a leather satchel balanced across his knees, and he sat at Silas Calder's own plank table, drinking Silas Calder's own coffee while he explained, in the courteous, distant voice men use when every decision that matters has already been made in a room she was never invited into, that the new owner would take possession on the first day of September and would prefer the cabin standing empty by the last day of August. Ambrose Teal was not a cruel man. He was something more common, and in some ways worse, a decent man performing an indecent errand carefully, and he did not once meet her eyes as he went down the list of what she could not keep. The standing timber was part of the parcel. The 2 cows were part of the parcel. The 4 hens, the mule, the harness in the shed, the very stove that had warmed her since she was 11. All of it had been counted and entered as part of the parcel and could not be removed. He allowed her the Bible and the tin box and the folding knife because she was wearing it, and he did not think to ask. He allowed her 1 wool blanket, 1 iron skillet, her mother's few pieces of clothing, and the heavy wool coat that had belonged to Silas himself, which she had been wearing since April, because her own was worn through at the elbows. He allowed her when she asked in a voice so level, it seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have, a small item from the drawer beneath the window, which she described only as a keepsake of no value, and which he waved through without looking, glad of any small mercy he could grant that cost the estate nothing. He did not allow her the rifle. The rifle, he said, with real regret in his tired face, was inventory. She looked at the rifle a long moment, the rifle Silas had taught her on, the rifle whose every part she could clean blindfolded, and then she looked away from it and said nothing, because she had already learned that there were losses you argued, and losses you simply carried, and that mistaking one kind for the other only doubled the weight. Ambrose Teal wrote out a receipt for the handful of things she was permitted to keep, set the paper on the table between them, and offered her his pen. She signed it without reading it a second time. He finished his coffee, put on his hat, thanked her for her time, as though she had done him a favor of some kind, and rode back down the valley into the long, slanting gold of a summer afternoon, growing smaller against the country until the sound of the mare was gone. She stood on the porch until the last of it faded, and then she went inside and began to fold her mother's clothes into the same paper sack she had carried up that valley 11 years before. She wrapped the skillet and the Bible and the tin box inside the wool blanket, tied the bundle with a length of tarred twine from the shed, and slept that last night on the bare boards beside the cold stove. Because the bed frame and the ticket held had been counted as inventory too. Before she slept, she took the small item Ambrose Teal had waved through and turned it once in the firelight. It was nothing. A length of braided horsehair Silas had made her as a girl, worthless to any man with a satchel, worth the whole valley to her. And she understood as she held it that this was the first real property she had ever owned free and clear, the things no one else could see the value of. In the morning, she shouldered the bundle, settled the knife at her hip, felt the 11 silver and paper dollars folded flat in the lining of her right boot, the whole of the money Silas had kept in a coffee tin in the pantry, and that Ambrose Teal, through oversight or some small private grace, had never thought to ask about, and she walked down out of the only home the world had ever let her keep, and did not look back at it, because looking back, she had decided, was a luxury for people who had somewhere to return to. Sable Bend in August was a town of dust and slow wagons, and the smell of horses standing tied in the hard sun. It sat where two roads crossed and a creek made a lazy elbow, a single long street of false-fronted stores, and a livery and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, the kind of place that existed because men needed to buy flour somewhere between the mines and the plains. Elspeth walked its length with the bundle riding on her shoulder and looked for work the way a person looks for water in dry country, without hurry, without any real expectation of finding it in the first place she tried, but looking all the same because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was the one thing her grandfather had never taught her how to do. She asked at the boarding house, where a hard-faced woman told her the beds were full. She asked at the freight office, where a clerk with ink to his wrists said they hired men to load, and that was all they hired. She asked at the small hotel, run by a widow named Mrs. Ashcombe, who took in mending on the side, and Mrs. Ashcombe looked at her a long, frank moment over a pair of spectacles, taking in the good coat that plainly belonged to a larger man, and the steady eyes that did not beg, and told her plainly that she already kept two girls and had no wages for a third, though she said it gently, the way a person delivers bad news they wish were otherwise. That first night, Elspeth slept behind the livery in a stall. The hostler let her have for a nickel, and she ate a heel of bread and a strip of dried beef she bought for 3 cents from the counter at the mercantile, and she lay in the straw and thought about the wind on the high ridge and the shape of the country north of town where she had ridden twice with Silas as a girl. And she was not afraid, exactly, but she felt the ground of her life go thin beneath her, the way ice goes thin at the center of a pond long before it looks any different from the shore. Word of a stranger with no place travels a small town faster than any wagon. On the second morning, a woman came to find her at the livery, an old laundress with flowers still on her forearms named Verna Stroud, who had known Ruth Calder as a girl in the days before Halcott, before any of it. Verna did not offer charity in words, which Elspeth would not have taken, but she left a folded flour sack apron and two dresses her own grown daughters had long outgrown, tied with string across the top rail of the stall, and she stood a moment, looking at the young woman with her mother's exact set to the jaw. "You have the look of Ruth about the eyes," she told her, and then, because she was not a woman who trusted soft moments to last, she added that a girl could do worse than to learn the wash trade, that there was always dirt in the world, and always someone too proud or too busy to clean their own, and that a woman who owned nothing but two good hands owned more than most men gave her credit for. She went back to her tubs before Elspeth could thank her. It was the second unasked for kindness of Elspeth's life in that town, and she marked it the way she marked a change in the wind, as information about which way things might yet turn. But 2 dresses and an apron were not wages, and wages were what she needed. And on the third morning she heard the thing that would change the direction of everything. The hostler mentioned it in passing, wiping down a bit, that a small party had come up from the east on the railroad and put up at Mrs. Ashcomb's, and that they were fitting out an expedition into the high country after bighorn and elk, and that they were asking, quietly, for a camp hand who knew the drainages above the ridge better than any man in town. They wanted someone, he said, who had been up there, really up there, not just to the near meadows where the town men hunted, but into the high broken country toward the divide where the maps ran out. Elspeth set down the bundle she had not put down in 2 days and asked him where they were. They were in the yard behind the assay office, loading a pack string. When she came to the gate and stood at it, the way her grandfather had taught her, to stand at the edge of another man's business, quiet, unhurried, letting herself be seen without pressing. There were 4 of them all told, 3 soft in the way of men who had done their hard living indoors, dressed in canvas and wool, 2 new and 2 clean for the country they meant to enter, and a 4th directing them who was not soft at all. He was heavy through the shoulders, clean in a trimmed dark beard, and he wore a canvas coat that had never seen a season of weather. And when he turned and saw her at the gate, he looked at her the way men in that country looked at a woman standing alone where she had no obvious business, without much interest, and with rather less courtesy. His name, she would learn, was Cyrus Creel, and he was the one who had been asking after her grandfather's country. She told him, when he came to the gate, that she could cook a camp, pack a mule, dress game clean, and find her way through country most men in that town would get themselves lost in by noon. He heard her out with the flat patience of a man being sold something he has already decided to buy cheap, and then he asked her whose girl she was. She told him. She watched his face when she said the name Calder, watched the small, still pause before he arranged his expression back into indifference, and she filed that pause away without knowing yet what it meant, the way she had filed away so much else. Silas Calder, he said, turning the name over slowly, as if tasting it, a man who scouted this whole divide back in the war, if the stories are true. She said the stories were true. And how much of that country, he asked, did the old man show his granddaughter? There was a hunger under the question that did not belong to any man planning to shoot a bighorn sheep, and some cold, careful animal at the back of Elspeth's mind lifted its head at the sound of it. But she was 3 days from her last full meal, sleeping in a stall, $11 from the end of everything, and the high country, in late August, was the nearest thing to home that remained to her in all the world. So she told him, truthfully, that Silas had shown her more of it than any living man had seen, and she watched the satisfaction move behind Creel's eyes, quick and quickly hidden, before he named his price. $4 for the trip, he said, and her meals, and she would answer for the horses at night. It was exactly what a man offered a woman he did not intend to value. And she knew it, and she said yes, without a word of bargaining, because $4 was $4, and because a person cannot always afford to hear what her own instincts are telling her. That night, she did not sleep well in the livery stall. She lay with the folding knife inside the roll of her blanket, her hand near the worn bone in the dark the way Silas had taught her, because a person who sleeps with a knife within reach sleeps easier than one who trusts a locked door. And she turned the day over in her mind. There was the pause when she said her name. There was the hand-drawn look of the map she had glimpsed folded in Creel's coat. A map with too few honest landmarks and too many small, careful markings. Nothing a sheep hunter would carry. There was the way the 3 Eastern men had not once looked at her, as though she were already a thing decided and set aside. She told herself she was tired and frightened, and inventing shapes in the dark the way a lost child invents them. And part of her almost believed it. And the wiser part of her, the part that Silas had built with 10 years of short nods, did not believe it at all. but hunger is an argument that wins more often than wisdom. And in the morning she rose and rolled her blanket and went to the yard to earn her $4. They rode out of Sable Bend at first light, 5 riders and 8 animals strung out along the creek, the aspens already showing the pale undersides of their leaves the way they do before the season turns, and Elspeth rode at the tail of the string where the hired hand rides, her bundle lashed behind the cantle. Silas's coat rolled across the front of her saddle, the country opening slowly out ahead of her, gray and green and blue in the far distance where the ridges climbed toward timberline on, and the maps gave up. She had ridden into that country before as a girl with a grandfather at her side, and the whole warm certainty of belonging somewhere. She rode into it now a grown woman with $11 in her boot, a borrowed coat, a folding knife, and the growing, quiet, unwelcome certainty that the 3 soft men ahead of her had not hired her to help them find sheep. She did not yet know what they had hired her to find. She only knew, watching Cyrus Creel's broad backs sway with the gait of his horse, that whatever it was, they meant to have it, and that a woman with no rifle and no witness was, to a certain kind of man, the cheapest tool in the pack. The creek ran clear and cold beside the trail, and she let the sound of it fill her, because the sound of moving water was the first thing Silas had ever taught her to listen to. The way it told you the shape of the ground you could not see. Read the water, he used to say, and you will never be truly lost. And she read it now the way a literate woman reads a page in a language no one around her can speak, taking in the whole country while the men ahead of her saw only the trail. She marked the side drainages as they passed. She counted the miles by the changing timber, scrub oak giving way to fir, fir thinning toward the high open parks. She noted which slopes she could cross on foot and which she could not, which draws held water and which lay dry, filing all of it down small and hard the way she had filed down every important thing since she was 9 years old and standing in a doorway holding a Bible with a cracked spine. Because whatever these men believed they had bought for $4, they had bought only her hands and her knowledge of the trail. They had not bought the thing Silas Calders had spent 10 years building inside her, the thing no satchel could inventory and no letter could sign away. And it was that thing, and not the $11, or the borrowed coat, or the good, bone-handled knife, that would carry her back down out of the wolf-toothed divide alive when the men who counted her at nothing had finished with her and gone. The high peak stood ahead in the morning light, patient, indifferent, older than every grievance and every deed in the valley below. And Elspeth Calder rode toward them at the tail of the string, with her grandfather's coat across her saddle, and her grandfather's country opening under her, not knowing yet how far she would fall before that country gave anything back, only knowing, the way she knew weather, that the falling had already begun. They climbed for 2 days into country that grew steeper and stranger with every mile, and the 3 Eastern men spoke less the higher they went, drawing in on themselves the way soft men do when the land stops flattering them. Their talk at the evening fires had a shape to it that Elspeth learned to hear beneath the words, a careful circling around some center they would not name in front of her. And she cooked their bacon and their beans and their fried biscuits and kept her eyes on the skillet while her ears did their patient work. If you have ever crouched over a cook fire in country that did not belong to you, and known by the smell of the smoke alone whether the meat was ready, then you understand the kind of attention she was paying. And if a quiet story like this one is worth something to you tonight, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because it helps these long stories find the people who need them. She would set the food down among the men and step back to the edge of the firelight. And there she would stand while they ate and talked. And in that way she gathered, night by night, the pieces of a thing she did not yet have the full shape of. On the second evening, the youngest of them, a narrow man with a city clerk's soft hands, whom the others called Poole, let a word slip that did not belong to any hunting trip. He spoke of stores, of a consignment, and Creel's boot came down hard on his instep under the guise of shifting closer to the fire. and Poole swallowed the rest of the sentence and did not finish it. Elspeth was pouring coffee 3 feet away and did not so much as lift her eyes, but the words settled into her like a seed into a crack. Stores. It was a soldier's word, a quartermaster's word, and there was only one reason a man would carry a hand-drawn map of country that held no ranches and no mines into the High Divide and speak in low voices of a consignment. And it had nothing to do with the big-horn sheep whose sign they had ridden past twice that day without a single one of them noticing. She understood then, with the cold clarity of creek water going through her, that she had not been hired to find animals. She had been hired to find a place, and the men who hired her believed that her grandfather had known where that place was, and they had gone looking for the one person left alive who might carry his knowledge in her head. The realization did not frighten her the way the men in the dark of the livery had frightened her. It steadied her, the way naming a fever steadies the person nursing it. A danger you can name is a danger you can begin to answer. She banked the fire that night the way she always did, staked the horses well, laid herself down a little apart, with the folding knife inside her blanket roll, and she made herself a small, hard promise in the dark that whatever these men were climbing toward, they would not climb over her to reach it. The third day broke gray and wrong. The aspens had turned their leaves clear over, showing pale, and the wind carried a thin edge that had no business in late August. And Elspeth read the sky, the way Silas had taught her, and did not like a single line of it. She said as much to Creel while she cinched the packs, told him plainly that weather was building off the northwest shoulder and that a wise party would drop down to the timber and wait it out rather than push higher into the open. He looked at the sky she was pointing at, that innocent-seeming gray, and then he looked at her with the flat contempt of a man who believed that anything he could not see was a fiction, invented to inconvenience him. And he told her they would push on, that they had come too far to lose a day to a woman's nerves. She said nothing more. She had delivered the warning honestly, which was all her conscience required, and she had learned long ago that you cannot make a man see weather he has decided not to believe in. By mid-morning, Creel gave the order she had been waiting for, without knowing she waited for it. He sent her ahead, alone, to scout the head of a long drainage he had chosen off the hand-drawn map. A drainage he described in a way that told her he had never seen it, and was reading its shape off paper drawn by someone who had. She was to ride to the top of it, he said, look for sign and for a particular formation of rock he described poorly, and come back and report. She looked at the 3 men and the 8 animals, and her own bundle lashed among the packs, and something in the arrangement of it struck her wrong. But she could not have said in that moment what a refusal would buy her, except a quarrel she could not win. So she took the bay gelding they gave her and rode up out of the camp into the rising wind. The drainage was empty, as she had known from the first quarter-mile that it would be. It held no sheep and no sign of sheep and no formation matching Creel's clumsy descriptions, and it was walled on 3 sides by chutes of loose scree that no animal with sense would cross. A dead pocket of the mountain that led nowhere and never had. She sat the gelding at the top of it a long moment, the wind pushing at her, and she understood that she had been sent to look at nothing, which meant she had been sent away, which was a different errand entirely. She turned the bay and rode back down hard, faster than the footing wanted. And when she came around the shoulder of stone into the little park where she had left the camp was gone. There was no smoke, no string of animals, no bundle, no borrowed thing of hers among the trampled grass. The fire had been kicked out and scattered. The tracks of 8 animals led down the mountain southward, back the way they had all come, and not one of them led up. She sat the gelding in the empty park with the wind rising around her, and did not, in that first moment, feel anything at all, the way a hand does not feel the cut in the first instant after the blade goes through. Then it came, not fear and not even anger yet, but a vast, clean understanding of exactly what had been done to her and exactly why. Creel had needed her to lead him into the high country because she knew it, and he did not. He had not, in the end, found what he came for or perhaps he had decided the finding lay closer than her knowledge could carry him. And either way, he had reached the point in his arithmetic where a woman with no family, no rifle, and no witness was worth more to him lost than kept. A stone dropped into a creek makes a small sound and then no sound at all. And that, she saw with perfect clarity, was what she had been meant to become. She did not ride south after them. South was where they wanted her to go. South was the long trail down where a lame horse or a wrong turn could finish what Creel had chosen not to do with his own hands. And south was where they would be, ahead of her, glancing back. She turned the bay east instead, toward the broken country that fell away into drainages she half remembered from a single summer she had ridden them. At 14 with her grandfather at her side, and she rode into the teeth of the weather she had warned Creel about, because the weather, at least, did not lie about what it was. The storm came down off the divide in the last hour of light, and it came the way high country storms come. All at once and without mercy, the temperature falling so fast, she felt it move across her skin like water. Rain turned to sleet, turned to a driving snow that erased the country a rifle shot in every direction. And the bay gelding city broke, and unused to real mountains, began to fight her, jerking its head and balking at every dark shape the snow made of the rocks. She got down and led it, because a frightened horse on bad footing in a whiteout will kill you faster than the cold. And she went ahead of it on foot into the storm, with the reins wrapped twice around her fist, and Silas's coat buttoned to her throat, breaking a path by feel and by the fall of the land, reading the mountain through the soles of her boots the way her father had once read a bad belt through his. The gelding threw its shoe on a stretch of ice-slicked shale sometime in the black middle of that storm, and within the hour it was limping so badly that leading it became a cruelty to them both. She stripped the saddle and the blanket and the bridle from it in the dark, her fingers gone stiff and clumsy on the buckles, and she turned it loose to find its own way down to timber and grass and whatever mercy the mountain kept for animals, because there was nothing else to be done, and dragging a lamed horse to death would not save her. Then she went on alone, the saddle blanket over her shoulders against the wet, the folding knife at her hip, the $11 still folded flat in her boot, as if money could mean anything at all in a place like that. And for the first time since the doorway of her childhood, she was truly and completely alone in the world, with no living thing that knew her name for 40 miles in any direction. She did not walk through that whole night, because walking blind through a whiteout on unknown ground is not courage but a slow form of throwing your own life away, and Silas had taught her the difference. She found the lee of a great fallen fir where the snow had not yet filled, and she dug herself down into the duff and needles at its base the way an animal digs, and she pulled the saddle blanket and Silas's coat around her and made herself as small and as still as a living thing can make itself, conserving the one fire she carried that the mountain could not put out, the warmth of her own blood. A person who panics in the cold burns through her heat in an hour and has nothing left for the long dark. A person who stills herself and waits can last until morning. She stilled herself. She thought of her grandfather's short nods. She thought of the smell of the stove and the sound of moving water. And somewhere in the worst of it she slept, a little, which is its own kind of miracle. And when the gray light came, the snow had stopped, and the world was white and blinding and utterly silent. And she was alive. She was alive, but she was not whole. When she rose from her hollow under the fir and put her weight on her right foot, a bright hard pain shot up from the ankle, and she looked down and understood that somewhere in the night's blind walking, she had wrenched it badly on the shale, and that the cold had masked the injury until now. She sat back down and worked the boot off with her teeth gritted dollars in the lining, and she found the ankle swollen tight and darkening. Not broken, she judged, testing it with her fingers the way Silas had shown her to test a horse's leg, but sprained hard enough that every step from here would cost her. She could not afford to let the boot off for long in that cold. So she wrapped the ankle tight, in a strip cut from the saddle blanket with the folding knife, worked the boot back on over the wrapping while it would still go, and laced it hard to make a splint of the leather itself. Then she stood and took a step and did not fall. And that was the whole of what she asked of herself in that moment. One step that did not end in falling, and then another after it. The country east of the divide dropped away in long timbered benches, and she went down through it slowly, favoring the ankle, using a fir branch she cut and trimmed as a staff, reading the land for the easiest grade the way water reads it. She was hungry in a way she had not been hungry since her mother's house went silent. A deep, gnawing hollowness that made her hands shake and her thoughts go slow. And there was nothing in that high timber to eat that a person could gather in August without a snare or a gun. So she did the only thing there was to do, which was to keep moving toward lower country where water ran and things grew, and to spend no strength on the hunger she could not feed. She drank from a snowmelt rill that afternoon, lying flat on the cold stones to reach it. And the water was so cold it ached in her teeth, and it was the finest thing she had ever tasted. And she understood, as she drank it, something her grandfather had tried to tell her once, and she had been too young to hear, that the whole of a life can narrow down to a swallow of clean water, and the strength to stand up after, and that a person who has learned to be grateful for exactly that is very hard to defeat. That second night in the wild nearly undid the small, hard promise she had made herself over the fire. She had made her camp in the lee of a granite outcrop, a dry hollow out of the wind, and she had allowed herself no fire because she had nothing to cook, and a fire in the dark is a beacon that carries for miles. It was that decision, the cold decision to stay dark, that saved her, because sometime after full night, she saw a light down the mountain and to the south, a small orange bloom in the black that could only be a campfire, and she knew with a lurch of her stomach whose fire it had to be. Creel had not gone all the way down. Creel was still in the high country, camped a mile or two below her, which meant Creel had not found what he came for and was still hunting it. The empty drainage, which meant the empty drainage, and the abandoned woman had bought him nothing but a clear conscience he did not possess. She lay in her dark hollow and watched that distant fire the way a rabbit watches a coyote's shadow, and she made herself smaller, and she did not sleep until it guttered out toward dawn. And she understood that the men who had left her for dead were not behind her at all. They were below her, between her and every road home. And the mountain that had nearly killed her in the night was now the only thing keeping her hidden. In the gray of the third morning, she came down off the last high bench with her ankle aching and her strength nearly gone, and she followed a narrow game trail that switched down through spruce toward the sound of water, because water ran downhill, and downhill was where people were, and she had reached the point where she would risk being found rather than sit down in the timber and not get up again. The trail dropped into a cleft she did not remember and could not have remembered, because as it opened before her, she saw that it was not on any map, not on the army's, and not on Creel's, and not in the memory of any summer she had ridden with Silas. It was a ravine the mountain had kept to itself, narrow-walled and green, a seam in the country that a person could ride past 100 times and never see the mouth of, and, at its lower end, where the walls fell back, and a spring made a bright ribbon through a small flat bench of grass, there stood a cabin. She stopped at the sight of it, the way you stop when a thing you need appears so exactly that you distrust your own eyes. It was built of squared lodgepole logs, chinked with clay and horsehair gone gray, roofed with split shakes silvered under 20 seasons of weather, small, no more than 14 feet by 18, and it stood with a stillness that told her, before she reached it, that no one had crossed its threshold in a very long time. The door was two thick planks pinned with wooden pegs and hung on hand-forged strap hinges, and it stood a quarter open on a drift of pine needles that had blown in over the sill and lain there undisturbed through more winters than she could guess. Above the door, cut into the top log with a chisel by some patient hand long ago, was a small five-pointed star, the wood of the cut gone dark with age. She stood in the grass of the bench and looked at that star a long moment, and then she crossed to the door on her ruined ankle and pushed it open. and the smell that came out to meet her was dust and cured pine and cold stone, and the particular silence of a place that has been waiting. Inside, the air was dry and still, and years deep. A stone hearth stood in the north wall, built of round river cobbles set in lime mortar, and beside it squatted a small cast iron stove of a make she did not know, its pipe intact and running up through the roof, its damper stiff with disuse but whole. There was a plank table worn smooth on top, a single three-legged stool, a rope-strung bed frame with no tick upon it, and a set of shelves nailed to the west wall. On the shelves, laid out as neatly as a careful man leaves his few things, were 3 tin plates, 2 tin cups, a whetstone worn to a saddle in the middle, a tin of matches gone entirely to rust, a coil of hemp rope stiff with age, and a leather-bound ledger with a bootlace tied twice around it to keep its covers shut. The floor was of wide, split puncheons, worn to a smooth track from the door to the hearth by feet that had crossed it many hundreds of times over many years. And then, at some point she could feel in the silence of the place, had stopped crossing it entirely. She did not open the ledger. She was a starving woman with a wrenched ankle and cold to the bone, and a starving woman does not read. She survives and reads afterward if she lives. So she did first the things that the living do. She limped to the spring and drank from one of the tin cups until the shaking in her hands began to ease, and she filled the cup twice more and drank that too. She gathered an armful of dry twigs and fallen cones from the edge of the bench, moving slow on the bad ankle, and she carried them in and knelt at the little iron stove and built the small, careful nest of a fire that Silas had taught her to build, tinder to kindling to fuel, and she coaxed it up on the third match from the rusted tin, her breath held, until the flame caught and steadied, and the first heat in 3 days touched her face. She sat down on the puncheon floor, in front of the open stove door, and put her hands out to it, and watched the firelight move on the old smooth logs, and she did not weep, though something in her chest loosened, that had been clenched tight since the empty park, because a person who has been written out of the world's account does not weep when she finds a fire. She only lets herself believe, for the first time, that she may yet be a person again. When the warmth had gone all the way into her, and her thoughts had come back from the far, slow, country hunger had sent them to, she searched the cabin for anything a body could eat, and she found in a tin box on the highest shelf a store of things the mice had somehow spared, hard as stone but sound, a twist of dried beans, and a little sack of parched corn, and a knot of tallow gone waxy with age. She soaked the beans and the corn in a tin cup of spring water on the warming stove, and while they softened, she chewed a small bitter piece of the tallow for the strength in it. And it was a poor meal and a strange one, but it was food that a dead man had left for whoever came after him. And eating it, she felt for the first time the presence of the person who had built this place, reaching across a gulf of years to keep a stranger alive. Only then, warmed and fed and no longer shaking, did she take down the ledger from the shelf and untie the brittle bootlace and open it on the plank table, by the light that came through the single small window. The first page was written in a careful, upright hand in brown ink gone nearly to sepia, and it named the man before it named anything else. I built this cabin with my own hands in the spring of 1866. It read, on ground I came upon by accident and chose to keep, being at that time 39 years of age and lately mustered out of the Union Army, where I served as clerk in the quartermaster's department under Colonel Prescott through the mountain operations of 1863 and 1864, of which more is set down further on. The name at the bottom of that first page, signed with a small flourish, was Amos Fell. She read slowly, one finger beneath the lines the way her grandfather had taught her to read when the words came hard, while the fire ticked in the stove and the light through the window moved a slow inch along the puncheons. Amos Fell had lived in this cabin 19 winters. He had trapped marten and mink along the ravine, taken his 2 elk a year, cut his own wood, and by his own account gone down into the settlements only when he could not carry a thing up on his own back. He wrote of the weather in the patient way of a man with no one to talk to but a book. He wrote of a dog named Pilot that had died in his 11th winter, and whose grave he had marked with a flat stone at the head of the spring. He wrote of a woman he had loved before the war, and not married, and never seen again. And he wrote of her without bitterness, the way a man writes of a country he passed through once and could not stay in. There was a loneliness in every page of it that Elspeth felt in her own chest. The loneliness of a person who has learned to make a whole life out of the small daily kindnesses of doing a thing well. And she understood him the way she understood few living people, because it was the loneliness Silas had carried too, and the loneliness that was reaching now for her. Then she came to the entry dated November of 1884, and the hand in it was less steady, and the words changed everything. My heart has begun to trouble me this past month, Amos Fell had written, and I do not think I will see another spring, and so I mean to set down at last, in the back of this book, certain matters I have carried alone for 20 years, that they may do some good for whoever is meant to find them, if any decent person ever is. Elspeth turned the pages toward the back with a care that had nothing to do with their age. The last written entry was dated the second week of December, 1884, and after it the pages ran blank, and behind the final blank page, sewn into the binding with waxed linen thread gone stiff and dark, was a folded square of oiled paper. She cut the old thread with the folding knife, her hands steadier now than they had been in 3 days, and she unfolded the oiled paper flat on the table, and inside it were 3 things. There was a hand-drawn map of the ravine and the ground above it, marked in Amos Fell's careful hand, with a small ink cross at the base of the hearth. There was a sealed letter, the wax unbroken, addressed in that same hand to whoever finds this being a person in need. And there was a smaller, older sheet, written in a different and blockier hand, and a darker, older ink, and across the top of it were words that made the small hairs rise on the back of Elspeth's neck. Inventory of stores cached at Site 9, Prescott Detachment, spring of 1864. She read the inked cross on the map, and she read it again. And then she set the 3 papers side by side on the table, and looked at the hearth across the room, the way a person looks at a locked door she has just been handed the key to. She did not open the sealed letter. Some instinct told her that the letter was the heart of the thing, and that a heart should be come to last, after the hands have done their work. And so she folded the map open in her palm and rose from the stool and crossed to the hearth on her wrapped ankle and knelt down on the worn puncheons before it. The river cobbles at the base of the hearth were set in lime mortar like all the rest, courses of gray stone in gray mortar, and at first her eye found nothing. Then she looked the way Silas had taught her to look at a thing, not for what stood out, but for what did not match. And she saw it, a section no bigger than a dinner plate where the mortar was a shade paler and a touch finer in its grain than the mortar around it, as though it had been mixed and laid at a later time by the same careful hand that laid the first. She worked the point of the folding knife into the seam of it, patient as her grandfather skinning a mink, and chipped the paler mortar out of the joints one by one. And it came away in dry crumbs and small clean pieces. And when she had freed the section, she set the knife aside and worked 4 of the cobbles loose with her fingers and lifted them out and set them on the floor beside her. Beneath them, sunk into the stone of the hearth's foundation, was a shallow box lined with tin and closed with a fitted plank lid. And when she lifted the lid, the smell of old canvas and older metal came up to her out of 20 years of dark. There was a canvas sack, heavy and stiff, its mouth stitched shut with cord, and when she cut the stitches with the knife and tipped it, gold coins ran out onto the plank floor with a small dry sound like rain on a roof. Double eagles by the look of them, more than she could take in at a glance, so many that she stopped trying to count and set the sack aside with her heart going hard in her chest. There was a second smaller sack, heavier for its size, that held silver dollars packed tight. There was a bundle of paper currency wrapped in oilcloth and banded, dry and sound. There was a folded army map, printed and then annotated in pencil, in a hand that was neither Amos Fell's nor the blocky hand of the inventory, showing a stretch of the very drainages she had ridden with Creel, with numbered sites circled along the high divide. And underneath all of it Wrapped by itself in a square of blue wool that had once been part of a soldier's coat, lay a single small object that she lifted out and turned over in the firelight. And when she saw what was cut into the back of its case, the whole of the last 3 days, the empty park and the storm, and the ruined ankle and the long hunger, went out of her like breath. She sat back hard on the cold stone of the floor with the thing held in both hands, because engraved into the brass in a small even script were the letters S, C, and beneath them the year 1863. She sat on the cold hearthstone a long while, with her grandfather's compass cupped in both hands, and the fire burned down 2 full lengths of pine before she trusted herself to move. The engraving swam a little under her thumb as she traced it, SC, and the year, cut by the same maker's hand that had cut the initials into the folding knife at her hip, and the meaning of it arranged itself in her mind, piece by piece, the way the country had once arranged itself under her as a girl. Silas had left this compass in the keeping of a quartermaster's clerk on the night of a river crossing and had never gotten it back. Amos Fell had been a quartermaster's clerk, the man who built this cabin and cached this gold, and wrote in this ledger of a decent thing he meant to do, was the same man her grandfather had spoken of once by a ticking stove, the careful man who never lied to him. And the compass had traveled 20 years through the hands of 2 lonely men to arrive, at last, in the hands of the one person on earth who could understand what it was. Some things are not found, she thought, turning the brass so it caught the light. They are given a long way ahead of time by people who will never live to see the hand that finally closes around them. She did not open Amos Fell's sealed letter that night, though it lay on the table an arm's length from where she sat. She had made herself a rule on the mountain, in the storm, that she would come to the heart of a thing only after her hands had done their work, and her hands were not finished. She was a woman with a wrenched ankle and a cache of gold in a cabin that 4 men were still hunting somewhere below her in the dark, and sentiment could wait for safety. She gathered the spilled double eagles back into the canvas sack, counting them now with the flat attention she gave to counting cartridges, and the number she reached made her set the sack down and sit still a moment, because it was more money than every soul in Sable Bend would see pass through their hands in 10 years of hard work. She replaced the tin-lined box in its socket beneath the hearth, fitted the 4 cobbles back over it without mortar so she could reach it again, and laid the square of blue wool across the stones to mark it. The compass she did not put back. She slipped it into the breast pocket of Silas's coat, over her heart, where her hand could find it without her eyes, the way she had once carried the braided horsehair, the way a person carries the small proofs that she was loved. Morning came thin and cold to the ravine, and with it came the first hard problem of her new circumstance, which was that a fortune is worth nothing to a woman who cannot walk out of the mountains to spend it, and that the men who had left her to die stood squarely between her and every road down. She could not go the way she had come. The divide was above her, snowbound now, and impassable on a bad ankle. She could not go south where Creel had gone. The ravine's mouth opened east and a little north, into country she did not know, and she stood in the doorway under the chiseled star and read the fall of the land, the way she read everything, looking for the seam of least resistance, and she saw that the spring's small creek ran off the bench and down through a cleft toward lower timber, and that water, as it always did, would show her the way to people. But not yet. Not on an ankle that turned the ground to knives. She needed it sound under her before she trusted her life to it. And so she made the hardest decision available to a hunted woman, which was to stay and heal and let the mountain hide her a while longer. She spent 4 days in Amos Fell's cabin, making it fit to live in and making herself fit to leave it. And the work was the same work her grandfather had drilled into her hands until it lived below thought. She swept the puncheon floor with a broom. She bound from spruce twigs on a peeled handle. She scraped the caked ash from the little stove and ran a straightened nail on a wire through the pipe until it drew clean and true. She dug fresh clay from the spring bank and mixed it with horsehair pulled from the underside of the abandoned saddle and worked it into the two chinks in the north wall where the winter came through. She rewove the sagging rope of the bed frame in the diamond pattern Silas had shown her one snowbound evening when she was 12, and she cut meadow grass with the folding knife and dried it 3 days on the warm shakes of the roof to fill a tick, so that on the fourth night she slept off the ground for the first time since the storm. Every hour she was not working, she kept the ankle wrapped and raised and cooled with cloth soaked in the spring, and by the fourth morning she could set her full weight on it and walk the length of the bench without the staff, and she knew the mountain had given her back her feet. On that fourth morning she took 4 double eagles from the cache and no more, wrapped them in a scrap of cloth, and worked them down into her right boot beside the $11. Because a woman walking out of the wilderness with a fortune on her is a woman inviting the same fate she had just escaped, and 4 coins were enough to begin a life and small enough to hide. She folded the annotated army map flat inside the leather ledger and tied the whole of it shut with the bootlace, because those papers were evidence of a thing far larger than her own troubles, and she meant to put them into the hands of the law. She banked the fire to embers, set the door true on its hinges behind her, and walked down out of the ravine along the spring small creek with the compass over her heart and the ledger under her arm, following the water the way she had been taught, until the cleft widened and the timber fell away, and she came near the end of the second day of walking onto a wagon road she knew and followed it into Sable Bend. It was a Thursday when she came into town in the middle of the day, thinner than she had left it, her borrowed coat stained with clay and smoke, her ankles stiff but sound, and the people on the long street stopped what they were doing to look at her, because a woman they had watched ride out with a party of Eastern gentlemen, 3 weeks gone, and never seen return, does not walk back into town alone, without becoming, in an instant, the most interesting thing that has happened all summer. She did not stop to answer any of their faces. She went first, and directly, to the marshal's office at the near end of the street, a low building of squared logs with a planked door, and she went in without knocking, because what she carried would not wait on courtesy. The marshal of Sable Bend was a spare, gray man of past 50 named Elias Boone, a widower these 9 years, who had buried a wife and outlived most of his illusions and kept the peace of a hard county with more patience than powder. He was at his desk with a green ledger open before him when she came in, and he took in the state of her coat and the steadiness of her eyes in a single glance, and set down his pen, because he had been a lawman long enough to know the difference between a woman come to complain and a woman come to report a crime. She laid it out for him plainly, in the level voice Silas had built in her, without heat and without a wasted word, how she had been hired as a camp hand by a man named Cyrus Creel and the 3 others from the east, how she had been sent to scout an empty drainage and return to find the party gone and the tracks running down the mountain, how she had walked out of the high country over 4 days and would not have walked out at all had the weather broken the other way. Boone wrote it down in the green book in a slow, square hand, and he asked her twice to repeat the name Creel, and something moved behind his gray eyes the second time she said it. He had suspected that party of business other than hunting, he told her, tapping the pen against the desk, from the moment they stepped off the railroad with soft hands and hard questions, and no dogs, for no man goes after high country elk without dogs. He said he would ride up and cut their trail. Then Elspeth set the leather ledger on his desk, untied the bootlace, and opened it to the annotated army map with its numbered sites circled along the divide, and she watched the marshal's face change from a lawman's practiced patience to something sharper and older as he understood what he was looking at. He knew the shape of it before she finished explaining, because he was old enough to remember the war, and old enough to have heard the rumor that ran under these mountains, like a vein of poor ore, the rumor of an army payroll and a consignment of stores, cached somewhere in the High Divide in the last year of the fighting, and never recovered. A rumor that surfaced every few years, and drew a certain kind of man up into the peaks to dig and come back empty. He had taken it for a tale, the way he took most tales. He was not taking it for a tale now. With a dead clerk's inventory open on his desk, and a living woman across from him who had found the cash and had the sense to bring him the map instead of the gold. "You've handed me the one thing that turns a rumor into a federal matter," he told her, closing the ledger with care, "and you've handed it to me instead of running with it, which tells me more about you than any letter of character could." Off. He asked her where the cash was. She told him it was safe, and that she would take him to it when the men who had left her for dead were no longer loose in the country between here and there. And Boone looked at her a long moment and did not press her, because he judged, correctly, that she had earned the right to set that condition. From the marshal's office, she went to the land office, a narrow room that smelled of dust and ink, presided over by a thin, careful clerk named Thaddeus Klein, a man who wore a green eyeshade against a window that faced away from the sun and asked no question the law did not require him to ask. She paid a filing fee of $1.75 in coin from her boot and recorded a homestead claim on the ravine and the bench above the spring, describing the ground by its watercourses and its bearings the way Silas had taught her to describe country. And Klein searched his patent books twice and found the ground unentered on any of them, never served, never claimed, a seam the government itself had overlooked. He wrote her name into the book in his fine, close hand, Elspeth Calder, and he told her, without looking up from the page, that she was the first person in his 11 years at that desk to file on ground he had not known existed, and that he found it a satisfying thing to record. She left the land office, holding a receipt for the first property she had ever owned that a man with a satchel could not take back. She changed one of the 4 double eagles into working coin at the mercantile of a broad, fair-dealing man named Wren Holloway, who kept an honest scale and did not ask where a stranger's gold had come from. Because, in that country, a man learned that some questions cost more in goodwill than the answers were worth. With the coin she bought flour, salt, coffee, lard, 6 boxes of matches, a second wool blanket, a small felling axe, a whetstone finer than the worn one on Amos Fell's shelf, and a used single-shot rifle with a box of cartridges, because a woman who had once let a rifle be counted as inventory had promised herself she would never again be caught in wild country without one. Holloway carried the goods to the door himself, and would not take a coin for the carrying, and he told her, weighing the axe in his hand before he passed it over, that Silas Calder had grub-staked his own father through a bad winter 30 years back, and never asked to be paid, and that the Halloways kept their accounts longer than most. It was the first Elspeth had heard of it. She was learning, coin by coin and kindness by kindness, that the grandfather who had taught her the country had also, quietly, all his life, been salting that country with debts of decency that were only now, after his death, coming back to his blood. Word of her went down the long street the way water finds every low place. Verna Stroud came out from her wash-yard with her forearms bare and set a warm loaf and a wedge of hard cheese into Elspeth's free hand, without a word about payment, saying only that a woman come down alive off the divide had earned a supper she did not have to cook. Mrs. Ashcombe, who had told her 3 weeks earlier that she had no wages for a third girl, came to the door of her hotel and said, with the stiff dignity of a proud woman correcting herself, that there was a room at the back that Elspeth might use whenever weather or business held her in town, and that it would be understood to be hers, and no charge made for it. A blacksmith named Gunnar Voss, a slab-shouldered man with pale far north eyes and a forge his own father had raised in that valley, shod the mule, and pack-horse Elspeth arranged to hire and refused payment past a cup of coffee, saying that he had bought his first anvil off Silas Calder for half its worth. In a year he could not have afforded the whole, and that the account had stood open a long time and he was glad to close a corner of it. She took each of these kindnesses the way she took a shift in the weather, as true information about the country she had come back into, and she understood that she had ridden out of Sable Bend 3 weeks before as a stranger with no place, and had walked back into it as Silas Calder's granddaughter, which, in that country, was a thing with weight. Marshal Boone rode up into the high country the next morning with 2 men he trusted, and he was gone 6 days. And Elspeth spent them in the room at the back of Mrs. Ashcomb's hotel, healing her ankle the rest of the way and buying, piece by careful piece, the things a woman needs to hold a homestead through a mountain winter. She did not spend freely. She spent the way a person spends who has been poor in her bones, on tools and stores, and nothing that would not earn its keep. And she kept the greater part of the cash where it lay, untouched under the hearthstone, because she had not yet decided what a fortune was for, having never in her life had the luxury of the question. On the 6th evening, Boone rode back down the street in the last of the light with 2 of the 3 Eastern men tied wrist to saddle behind him. The soft-handed young one called Poole and one other, and Elspeth watched from the window of the hotel as they came, and she felt no triumph, only the flat settling of a thing coming into its proper place. Boone came to find her at the hotel that evening, turning his hat in his hands in the doorway, and what he told her put the triumph further off still. They had cut the party's trail and run it down 2 valleys south, and they had taken Poole and the one other man without a fight, both of them half-starved and glad, in the end, to be taken. The third of the Eastern men had lost his nerve in the storm and started down on his own days before, and a freighter had picked him up wandering the low road and delivered him to a constable in the rail town below, so that all 3 of the soft men were accounted for and in the law's hands. But Creel was not among them. Creel had split off from the others 4 days before the capture, the men said, and he had not gone down out of the mountains at all. He had gone back up, Poole told Boone, in the flat, exhausted voice of a man with nothing left to protect, that Creel had come to believe in the last days that the woman they left on the ridge had not died, that anyone raised by Silas Calder would not die so easily, and that if she lived, she would go to ground in exactly the kind of hidden country a man might cash an army payroll in, and that finding her might be the surest way of finding the gold. Creel had gone back up to hunt her. He was somewhere in the high country now, alone, patient, and certain that the woman he had left for dead was the map he had been missing all along. Elspeth stood very still at that, and the old cold animal at the back of her mind, the one that had lifted its head at the gate 3 weeks before, came fully awake. The danger had changed its shape. She was no longer a witness a man wanted silenced. She was a key a man wanted turned, which meant Creel would not try to make her vanish. He would try to make her lead him, or he would simply follow her. And the moment she walked back up to the ravine to show Marshal Boone the cache, she risked drawing the one man still loose in the mountains straight to the thing she most needed to protect. A lesser danger would have sent her running. This one, she understood, required her to stop running altogether and choose the ground. She made the choice standing at the window of Mrs. Ashcomb's hotel, and she laid it out for Boone the way Silas would have laid out a hunt. She would not wait in town for Creel to be found in 100 square miles of peaks that had already swallowed a whole detachment's worth of gold. She would go up to the ravine herself, openly as a woman going home to her claim, and she would let it be known in the mercantile and the livery exactly where she was going, and why. Because Creel had ears in a town this size, the same as anyone. She would draw him to the one piece of ground on the mountain that she knew better than any living soul. Ground she had spent 4 days learning to the last cobble. And Boone and his men would come behind her, a day back and out of sight, and take Creel when he closed on the cabin. It was a hard plan, a plan that used herself as the bait on the hook, and Boone did not like it, and he said so plainly that he had not spent 9 years keeping the peace to send a woman up a mountain to be hunted. She heard him out, and then she told him the thing that ended the argument. A trap only works if the thing inside it is worth the animal's while, she reminded him, and there is nothing in these mountains that man wants more than what he thinks I carry in my head. Boone looked at her a long moment, the way men in that town had begun to look at her, and he agreed. She rode up to the ravine on the hired mule 2 mornings later, with the pack horse behind and the single-shot rifle in a scabbard she had stitched herself, and she made no secret of her going, telling Wren Holloway at the mercantile that she was away to her claim on the high bench and did not know when she would next be down, and telling it loud enough that 3 other men heard. The plan was already moving as she rode out. Boone and his 2 deputies would leave that same evening by a different trail and come up behind her the following day, close enough to strike and far enough back that no watcher would connect the woman going home to the lawman on her trail. She rode up through the timber, alone with her nerves drawn fine, reading every dark shape in the trees. And she reached the mouth of the ravine near dusk and rode in under the chiseled star and put the animals in the pole, lean-to she had built against the south wall. And she went into Amos Fell's cabin and lit a lamp in the window, because a trap must be baited with light, and let the whole ravine know that the woman was home. Creel came in the gray hour before the second dawn, and he was better at the country than she had given him credit for, because she did not hear him cross the bench. She knew he had come only when the lamp in the window guttered in a draft that should not have reached it, which meant the door had opened, and she came up off the rope bed with the single-shot rifle already in her hands, and the hammer back, because she had slept in her boots with the rifle across her chest every night since she rode up, and she had promised herself she would never again be caught without it. Creel stood just inside the door, with a pistol held loose at his side and an expression on his bearded face that was almost admiration, the look of a man who has bet on a horse against the whole field and watched it come in. "I knew you weren't dead," he told her, easing the door shut behind him with his heel, his eyes moving once around the cabin, over the swept floor and the mended chinking and the fire banked warm in the little stove, taking the measure of the life she had made in the place he had come to rob. A Calder wouldn't have the decency to die when it was convenient. He had not raised the pistol. He did not need to yet, and they both knew it. 2 people in a small room in the dark with the weapons even, and the will uneven, because Creel wanted something from her alive, and Elspeth wanted only to hold the ground until the morning. He asked her where it was. She kept the rifle level on him and told him she did not know what he meant, and he smiled at that, a slow, patient smile, and told her not to insult them both, that a woman did not file a homestead on empty ground and buy a winter's stores with gold no one had ever seen her earn. She understood, in the length of that smile, how much he already knew, and how little time the knowing left her. He had pieced it together the way she had feared he would, from the coin at Holloway's scale, and the claim in Klein's book, and the plain fact of her survival. And he had come not on suspicion, but on certainty. And a certain man is more dangerous than a hopeful one, because he cannot be turned aside with a doubt. She had one thing he did not, which was the ground, and one thing she had not counted on needing, which was the truth of who had built that ground and why. And in the strange stretch calm of the standoff she reached for it, because a man convinced he is taking treasure from a stranger is a different animal than a man made to understand he is robbing the dead. This gold was cached by a union clerk named Amos Fell, she told him, her voice steady over the rifle's sights, and it was left in this cabin for whoever came to it in need, by a man who spent his last winter trying to do one decent thing before his heart gave out. Creel's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes flickered, the smallest reckoning, the calculation of a man who had told himself he was recovering lost army property and was now being asked to see himself as a grave robber instead. "It doesn't belong to the army anymore," she went on, giving him no room to settle back into his story, "and it doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't rightly belong even to me. It belongs to whoever it was meant for, and the only thing you'll carry out of this ravine is the same nothing every man before you carried down." She was buying minutes with words, and she knew it, keeping him talking, while the sky beyond the small window went from black to the first thin gray, because Boone was a day behind her, and the day was very nearly up. Creel took a step toward the hearth, his eyes going to the square of blue wool laid over the loose cobbles, and Elspeth saw him see it, saw him read the one thing in the swept and ordered room that did not belong, and she knew the standoff was ending whether she willed it or not. He crossed to the hearth in 2 strides and went down on one knee and swept the blue wool aside, and his free hand found the loose cobbles she had never remortared, and he laughed low in his chest at the ease of it, a man who has walked 100 miles and found the door standing open. He set the pistol on the stone beside him to work the cobbles loose with both hands, and that was his mistake, the one Silas had taught her to wait for. The moment a greedy man forgets the danger in the room, because the prize is under his fingers. And Elspeth did not fire, because she had promised Boone and herself that this would end without blood if she could make it end that way. Instead, she took one long step and put her boot down, hard on the pistol, on the hearthstone, and swung the rifle's barrel to hold him where he knelt. And she told him, in a voice her grandfather would have recognized, to take his hands off her floor. He froze with his fingers in the socket of the hearth, the golden inch from his grasp. And for one long breath, the whole thing hung on which of them would move. And then the plank door came open hard against the wall. And the gray dawn came in with Marshal Boone behind it, his own weapon level, and two deputies filling the doorway at his back, a full day early. Because Boone had not liked the plan and had ridden through the night to shorten the odds against her. Creel looked from the marshal to the woman, standing over his pistol with her boot on the barrel, and the fight went out of him the way it goes out of a man who has finally understood the shape of the trap he walked into. And he took his hands out of the hearth and raised them. And it was over, and no shot had been fired, and the gold lay untouched, where a dead man had left it for the living. Boone bound Creel's wrists himself and stood him against the wall. And while the deputies searched him, the marshal looked at the socket in the hearth and the canvas sack Creel had half dragged into the light, and he let out a low breath at the sight of it. You baited a hook with your own life and landed a man who'd have put you under this floor without losing sleep, he told Elspeth. And I've decided I never want to stand on the far side of a plan you've made. She did not smile at that, because the danger draining out of her body left something heavier in its place, the weight of how near the thing had run. But she took the words for what they were, which was the highest form of approval a hard man could give. And it landed on her the way her grandfather's short nods had landed. And she understood that she had, without ever meaning to, begun to become the kind of person other people measured themselves against. They took Creel down out of the mountains that day, and in the weeks that followed, the shape of the larger thing came clear, because a man facing a federal charge for the theft of army property talks a great deal in hope of a lighter accounting. And Cyrus Creel talked. He had not come to the High Divide on a rumor alone. He had been hired and half partnered, by a man in the South who had learned of the cache from an old inventory that had passed through the papers of a family, a man who had needed someone to find the ground, and had chosen Creel for his willingness to do the finding without asking hard questions. And when Boone pressed him for the name of the man who had set him on, Creel gave it, and the name was Calder. It was Alton Calder, Silas's own brother, the man who had inherited the 80 acres and sold them whole, and written Elspeth the small, neat letter that turned her out with a paper sack and a Bible. Boone brought her the news himself, and he watched her face as he gave it, and what he saw there was not surprise, but the slow settling of a last piece into a pattern she had felt the edge of for a long time, since a hurried line at the bottom of a letter she had not been able to explain. Alton had not sold the home place because he wanted the little money a worn-out mountain farm would bring. He had sold it because he had come across the same old inventory Creel worked from, somewhere in the family's papers, and had understood that Silas Calder had scouted the very country where an army payroll lay hidden, and had feared, above all things, that Silas's granddaughter, who knew that country as no one else alive did, might one day put the map and the ground together herself. He had turned her out and scattered her into the world, not out of ordinary greed, but out of a specific and calculating fear, to get her off the mountain and away from the knowledge in her own head before she could ever think to use it. He had thrown her away precisely because she was the one person who might find the thing he wanted, and, in doing so, he had sent her, by the long, hard road of the storm and the ravine, straight into the finding of it. The cruelest men build their own traps and walk into them smiling, she thought, standing in the marshal's office with the news settling into her. Because Alton Calder, in his fear of her, had done the one thing guaranteed to bring about the outcome he feared. Had he let her keep the home place, or given her the smallest share of the sale, she would have grieved her grandfather on that porch, and never once climbed back into the high divide. And the gold would have lain under Amos Fell's hearth until the mountain itself came down. Instead, he had cast her out with nothing, and nothing had driven her to hire on with Creel, and Creel had carried her up to within a day's walk of the cache before abandoning, and the abandoning had driven her east into the one ravine that held it. Every hand raised against her had, without knowing it, been passing her forward toward the thing she was meant to find, and the man who had raised the first of those hands would answer for it. Now before a federal court, his sale of the home place unraveling as the fruit of a scheme, his name entered in the same kind of record he had once used to dismiss her, facing the loss of far more than he had ever tried to take. Boone put the whole of it into the hands of a federal marshal who came up on the railroad, and the papers Elspeth had carried down out of the mountains, the ledger and the inventory, and the annotated map, became the spine of a case that took the better part of a year to close, and ended with Alton Calder ruined and bound over for trial, and with the cashed gold declared, after long argument between the government's men and the lawyers, to have passed out of the Army's hands so long ago and been so plainly abandoned and rededicated by Amos Fell's written bequest, that the greater part of it belonged, by the letter of that bequest, to whoever had found it in need. That was Elspeth, and no one who later read Amos Fell's sealed letter into the record could argue that she was anything other than exactly the person he had meant. But the letter was not yet open. It lay still in the ledger through all the long turning of the law, waiting because she had carried it down the mountain sealed and had made a private decision that she would not break the wax of it in a marshal's office or a courtroom or under any eyes but her own, that a letter written by a lonely man to whoever came after him deserved to be read the way it had been written, alone by lamplight, in the quiet, after the work was done. The work was a long time being done. She held the claim through that first winter, packing her stores up the ravine before the snow closed the cleft, and she wintered alone in Amos Fell's cabin, as Amos Fell had wintered in it, keeping the fire and the fences and her own counsel. And she came down to Sable Bend on the first Saturday of each month, the way her grandfather had once come down, and the town came to expect her and to keep small things for her against her coming. A running account at Holloway's, the back room at Mrs. Ashcomb's, a bar of hard soap that Verna Stroud set by on a shelf above the washtubs. In the spring, when the case had turned her way and the ground was hers past any man's power to question, Marshal Boone rode up himself with the patent to 160 acres of the bench and the ravine floor, signed and stamped and passed all argument, and he drank a cup of coffee at Amos Fell's plank table before he rode back down, and told her, setting the cup aside, that in 9 years of Hard County he had never once carried a paper up a mountain that he was gladder to deliver. She began that second season to guide. Hunters came out of Sable Bend in the fall, men who wanted elk and mule deer, and who asked at the livery for someone who knew the high drainages. And the hostler sent them up to her by name, and she charged $4 a day and their keep, the same figure Cyrus Creel had once named to buy her at nothing, and she was worth every cent of it, and they knew it. The men from town who had ridden past her at a livery gate the summer before, without seeing her now, took off their hats when they met her on the street, and it was not the gold that changed how they looked at her, because most of them never knew the whole of that story. It was the plain fact of a woman who had been carried up a mountain to disappear, and had walked back down it with a claim, a trade, and a name, and had done it, so far as anyone could see, on nothing but the skills a hard old man had drilled into her and the refusal to lie down. A person is not remembered for what is done to her, she had come to understand, but for what she makes of the ground where she is left standing. On a windless evening late in that second year, with the guiding season closed, and the first snow holding off, and the cabin warm around her, Elspeth Calder took down the ledger from the shelf where she kept it, and she drew out from between its pages the sealed letter she had carried, unopened through a storm, a standoff, and a year of the law's slow turning, and she set it on the plank table in the yellow light of the kerosene lamp she had bought from Wren Holloway. She sat a long moment with her hand flat upon it, the compass with her grandfather's initials warm in the breast pocket of the coat she still wore, and then she took the folding knife with its worn bone handle and its 3.5 inches of steel, the knife that had opened every sealed thing in her life since she was 17, and she slid it under the old wax and broke the seal a dead man had pressed more than 20 years before. And she unfolded the letter, and by the light of the lamp, she read, "If you are reading this," Amos Fell had written, "then you are the one I hoped for and never met, and the ground has kept its promise better than I dared to ask. I have no wife, no child, no near kin living to leave a thing to, and so I have spent my last good winter making certain that what came into my hands by the accidents of a war would go, in the end, to a person who arrived here the way I did, with nothing and in need. Take it, and do not let any man tell you that you did not earn it, for the earning was in the coming, and no one comes to this ravine who was not first driven very hard. There is a compass among these things that never belonged to me. It was left in my keeping by a scout named Silas Calder on the worst night of the war. A man who trusted me when trust could get a man killed, and I have carried the shame of never returning it for 20 years. And I ask now only that whoever finds it, if the world is kind enough to arrange it, will see the thing back into the hands of his people." Elspeth read that line 3 times. Her thumb pressed white against the edge of the paper, and the small cold cabin filled up around her with the presence of 2 dead men who had loved her in the dark from opposite ends of 20 years. One who had built her hands, and one who had built her a place to use them, neither of whom had ever known her face. She set the letter down at last, and took the compass from the pocket over her heart, and laid it on the plank table beside the folding knife, the 2 objects touching, and she looked at them a long time in the lamplight. Silas had carried the knife through the winter campaigns and put it in her hand on her 17th birthday. Silas had carried the compass through a river, crossing in the dark, and left it, with a clerk he trusted, for one terrible night, and the clerk had kept it faithfully for 20 years without ever finding the man to return it to, and had cached it in tin and stone against the chance that some decent stranger would come who could carry it home. The knife had come to her down the front of the years, hand to hand, in the ordinary way of a gift. The compass had come to her the long way around, through the ground, through a dead man's patience, through a storm and a betrayal, and a cache under a hearth, and it had arrived in the one pair of hands in all the world that could close around it and know exactly whose it was. She was the returning Amos Fell had prayed for, and the granddaughter Silas had made, and she was the same person. And the debt of a night in the war had at last been paid in full, to a messenger, to a man or 20 years in his grave, by a woman he never lived to meet. The ground remembers what men forget, she thought, and now and then, for the one patient enough to look, it gives back what a decent stranger tried to keep. The men who had ridden away from her at the head of an empty drainage had believed they were leaving a woman, with no witness in country she could not walk out of. What they had left her to was her own country, and her grandfather's country, and Amos Fell's country, and the ground had held for her, patient as stone, everything 2 decent men had tried to save. She had climbed into the wolf-toothed divide with a borrowed coat, a folding knife, and $11 folded flat in the lining of her boot, and she had come down out of it with a patent to 160 acres, a trade that men rode 2 days to hire, a table of her own that no letter could ever sign away, and the answered prayer of a lonely clerk resting in her palm. It was the best $11 she ever carried up a mountain, and the finest thing she ever brought down. So before you go on with your evening, wherever in this wide country you are sitting tonight, by a wood stove of your own, or in a city room far from any mountain, tell us in the comments the name of the person in your life who was your Silas Calder, The one who taught you to shave a branch down to its dry heart, or to read the weather in a turning leaf, or simply to stay still and steady until you knew what to do next. And if this story has kept you company down the length of its road, tap the subscribe button and share it with someone who has ever been counted out, dismissed by a letter in a small, neat hand, or told that a place they helped to build was no longer theirs to stand in because it costs you nothing. And it helps these long, quiet stories find their way to the people who most need to hear that the ground remembers and that it keeps and that it gives back at last to the hands patient enough to open what a decent stranger left behind.